The Russian was profuse in his gratitude for the help and protection accorded to his establishment. The emperor assured him that he had undertaken this war from purely political motives and from no spirit of animosity. Peace was his primary aim, as he had explained on more than one occasion. He added that he had been forced to come to Moscow in spite of himself, that he had done everything at Moscow, as elsewhere, to protect property and to suppress the incendiarism started by the Russians themselves. As soon as Monsieur Tutomina's letters were ready, he was given a passport and every other facility to enable one of his employees to act as courier to Petersburg. With the exception of the King of Naples' corps, the entire army was in the town or quartered close at hand. Fugitives from the fire had sought shelter in churches, cemeteries, or wherever they felt secure from annoyance by the troops. The churches, which for the most part stood in the clear on public squares, had offered also greater security from the ravages of the flames. Many of these unfortunate refugees had made their way out of Petrovskoye. We did what we could for them. I housed some 2,000 of them in the Galitzin mansion, and among the number was Monsieur Zagreevsky, master of the horse to the Tsar, who had hoped, by remaining in Moscow, to save his house, the object of his lifelong care. There was also a major general, German by birth, who had gone into retirement in Moscow after long service with the Empress Catherine. These unhappy men had lost everything. Nothing remained to them but the great coats which they wore. Our return to Moscow was no less gloomy than our departure. I cannot relate all that I have suffered since the death of my brother. The sense of these recent events was the last straw. The horror of all that was going on around us added to my grief at his loss. True, one cannot nurse one's personal troubles exclusively in the midst of so many public disasters, but one is only the more wretched on that account. I was overwhelmed. Happy are they who never saw that dire spectacle, that picture of destruction. A greater portion of the city was reduced to ashes. The northern district nearest the Kremlin had been saved by the wind shifting to the west. Some isolated districts where windward had not suffered at all. The splendid mansions all around the city had escaped the plans for their destruction. Only that of M. Rostopchin, the governor, had been burned to the ground by its proprietor. He had posted up a notice of his intention, unquestionably very patriotic in his own eyes, on the signposts that marked the road into his estate at Voronzovo, a short distance from Moscow. This notice was brought to the emperor, who turned the whole thing to ridicule. He joked a lot about it and sent it to Paris, where doubtless it produced, as it had in the army, an impression quite contrary to what His Majesty expected. It had a profound effect on every thinking man, and won the governor more admirers than critics, though only, of course, for the patriotism he had shown in sacrificing his house. This is how the notice was worded. For 8 years I have approved this land. I have lived happily here in the bosom of my family. To the number 1,720, the dwellers on my estate are leaving it at your approach, while, for my part, I am setting fire to my mansion, rather than let it be sullied by your presence. Frenchmen, in Moscow I have abandoned to you my 2 residences with furniture worth 500,000 rubles. Here you will find only ashes. Chapter 7. Indecision. Some days after his return to the Kremlin, the emperor announced openly that he had resolved to take up his winter quarters at Moscow, which, even in its present state, would furnish him with better accommodations and more supplies than any other place. He therefore put the Kremlin and the monasteries and convents round the city into a state of defense, and ordered several reconnaissances in the neighborhood with an eye to establishing a plan of defense for the winter. The emperor took many other measures in anticipation. He announced that he was ordering fresh levies of men in France and Poland, that he was preparing the organization of the Polish Cossacks, for which orders have already been issued, he said. Reserves had instructions to join us, and all the reinforcing detachments which had been echeloned in their advance were detailed to safeguard our rear, protect convoys, and keep open communications. The post houses were fortified. The courier service, which I had organized at the start of the campaign, was given special attention. The dispatch case of the emperor and the headquarters arrived regularly every day from Paris in 15, often 14 days. The emperor was always impatient for the arrival of his courier. He noticed the delay of a few hours and even grew anxious, though this service had never suffered any breakdown. The Paris portfolio, the packets from Warsaw and Vilna, were the thermometer of the emperor's good or bad humor. It was the same with all of us, for everyone's happiness depended on the news from France. Small consignments of wine and other objects arrived. Officers, surgeons, and administrative officials also came to join the army. The reports from the officers in command of the principal points in our lines of communication were reassuring. It was easy to travel from Moscow, as from Paris to Marseille. Yet everyone was loath to resign himself to passing the winter so far from France, whither all eyes and thoughts continually turned. We had been spoiled by the emperor's previous campaign, when peace had always been brought with a few months' toil. Except in the Prussian and Polish campaigns, winters had always been spent in France. And recollections of Osterode and Gutstadt, of the snows of Pultusk and Bratsnitz campaign of 1807, brought only somber reflections. Some, myself among the first, doubted whether the emperor really intended to pass the winter in Moscow. The immense distance between ourselves and Poland would give the enemy too many opportunities of harassing us, and there seemed 1,000 other considerations against carrying out this plan. On the other hand, the emperor busied himself with so many precautions, discussed them in such positive terms, and seemed to regard them as so essential to the success of his enterprise, if peace were not secured before the winter, that most of the incredulous among us ended by believing that he intended to go through with his plans. At that time, even the Grand Marshal and the Prince of Neuchâtel seemed convinced that we should remain in Moscow. Everyone laid plans accordingly and collected furniture and anything else abandoned in the city that might be useful for consolidating his domestic arrangements. Wood and forage were collected. In short, everyone acted as though he would certainly have to pass in Moscow for 8 months that must elapse before spring. For my part, I must confess that in the emperor's glibness in talking of this plan, as well as in the measures he took for carrying it out, I only saw the desire to give a turn to public opinion, to ensure the collection of provisions, and above all, to support the overtures he had made. Nobody knew of these overtures. Monsieur Tutumina had kept the secret as faithfully as Monsieur Lelorgna, who had been entrusted with the second attempt. But the emperor let fall a few words to the Prince of Neuchâtel as to the nature of his proposal.